It was a morning like any other, or so I thought. The light streamed through the thin curtains, casting soft, warm slats across the floor of my bedroom. I woke up to the faint sound of birds chirping outside and the distant hum of a car driving past. The clock read 8:23 a.m., late again. I stretched lazily, my mind slow to wake up, as the weight of the dream I had been in faded away. For a moment I couldn't quite remember what it had been about, only that it had felt strangely significant, like something important was about to happen, yet I couldn't grasp it fully. A momentary feeling of unease settled on my chest, but I brushed it aside as I dragged myself out of bed, the warmth of the covers reluctantly releasing me to the cold air of the room. Max, my dog, was already awake, his ears perked up as he stood by the window, watching the world outside. His tail wagged lazily when he noticed I was up, and he gave a soft whine of greeting. He was a large golden retriever, not quite a puppy anymore, but still full of energy and curiosity. His eyes always seemed to be full of wonder, even when the world around him was as mundane as a lazy morning at home. "Morning, buddy," I muttered, my voice rough with sleep. Max padded over to me, his feet light on the wooden floor, and nudged me with his nose, as if to say, "I've been waiting for you." I smiled, scratching behind his ears, the familiar scent of his fur comforting in the quiet of the house. After a few moments of shared silence, I shuffled my way into the bathroom, the soft padding of Max's paws following me as usual. I went through my morning routine, brushing my teeth, washing my face, staring at myself in the mirror as I tried to wake up fully. As I splashed cold water on my face, I caught a glimpse of myself in the reflection. My hair was a mess, and my eyes still held the remnants of sleep. I wasn't ready for the day, but there wasn't much choice in the matter. The house would be empty soon, and I needed to get moving. I headed to the kitchen, where the sound of the coffee machine greeted me with its familiar gurgle. The scent of the freshly brewed coffee quickly filled the room, stirring me awake a little more. Max stood by the back door, tail wagging, clearly ready to go out for our morning walk. I poured a cup of coffee and grabbed my jacket, slipping it on and heading out the door. The air outside was crisp and fresh, a light breeze tousling my hair as I stepped onto the sidewalk with Max at my side. There was something about the stillness of the morning that felt both calming and unnerving. The streets were quiet, as if the whole neighborhood was still asleep, and the world around us seemed to move in slow motion. The trees swayed gently in the wind, their leaves rustling softly, but nothing felt hurried. The moment seemed to stretch longer than it should have, almost as if the universe was holding its breath. Max trotted beside me, his leash tugging slightly with every step as he eagerly sniffed at the grass, his nose twitching as he picked up on every scent around him. He was always curious, always aware of the small details of the world, while I found myself lost in the fog of my thoughts. I couldn't help but notice the strange sense of foreboding that still lingered in the back of my mind. I tried to push it away, convincing myself it was just the tiredness of the morning, or the leftover remnants of the dream I'd had. We walked for a few more minutes, me lost in thought, Max lost in the world of smells and sounds. The sun was still low in the sky, casting a pale golden light over everything, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something in the distance. A figure standing by the corner of the street, almost too still, too quiet. I blinked and rubbed my eyes, unsure if the image was real. But when I looked again, the figure was gone, vanished as quickly as it had appeared. A shiver ran down my spine. My heart rate quickened, but I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just a trick of the light or my tired mind playing games. After all, I'd only just woken up, and I had a tendency to overthink things. We finished our walk, returning home to the stillness of the house. It felt strange to be back in the quiet, as though something had shifted just enough to make the familiar feel unfamiliar. I let Max inside, where he immediately bounded over to his favorite spot on the couch, his eyes half closed in contentment as he curled up into a ball. I grabbed my phone and checked the time. I had about an hour before I needed to get ready for the day. My parents were out for the morning doing their usual weekend errands, and it would just be me and Max until they came back. The house was mine to enjoy for a little while, a rare moment of solitude. I sank into the couch beside Max, holding my cup of coffee, and glanced at the TV, but nothing held my attention. My mind kept wandering back to the feeling from earlier, the odd sense that something was wrong, Maybe it was just the quiet. Or maybe it was the nagging feeling I had when I'd seen that figure on the street corner. I tried to push it away, but it lingered, hovering in the back of my thoughts. Max seemed to sense it too. He lifted his head from his paws, his eyes focused on the door, and his ears perked up. I turned to look at him, my heart skipping a beat. For a moment I wondered if he had sensed something that I hadn't. But he just let out a soft whine, his eyes returning to me as if to say, "Are you okay?" "Yeah," I muttered, though I didn't quite believe it myself. "I'm fine, Max." I took a deep breath and tried to settle back into the couch, willing my mind to quiet down. But the nagging feeling refused to leave me, growing heavier with every passing minute. I should have been doing something productive, something useful, but instead, I sat there, trapped in the stillness of the house, waiting for something to break the monotony. The sound of a car engine in the distance broke my thoughts, but it did nothing to ease the tension. My phone buzzed in my hand, and I glanced at the screen, seeing a text from my mom asking if everything was okay at home. I quickly responded with a simple yes, though my response didn't quite match how I was feeling. Something wasn't right. It wasn't until I heard the unmistakable sound of the front door opening that I finally realized what had been bothering me all morning. I froze, my heart jumping into my throat. The door shouldn't have been opening yet. My parents weren't supposed to be back for at least another hour. I stood up, my mind racing with possibilities. Had I forgotten something? Did they come back early for some reason? I hurried toward the hallway, my footsteps heavy and anxious as I rounded the corner. And then I saw it. My dad standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable as he looked at me with a bemused grin. He hadn't expected to find me home, especially not this early. But there was something in his eyes that told me he had seen enough. "Got back early," he said, raising an eyebrow. "What's going on here?" I felt my stomach drop. What did he know? What had he seen? My mind raced, unable to make sense of it. And then, in a quiet, almost surreal moment, I realized that whatever had been waiting to happen, whatever feeling of unease had followed me throughout the morning, had finally arrived. And nothing would ever be quite the same again. The morning had started like any other. I had woken up in the same room, to the same half-light that filtered through the curtains, casting soft golden beams onto the floor. The house, as usual, was silent, save for the distant ticking of the clock on the kitchen wall and the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath me. My dog, Max, had already made his way into the living room, his tail wagging in that uncontainable way that only he could manage. It was a routine, a comfort I had grown accustomed to, almost to the point of forgetting how much I relied on the predictability of my daily life. But even the quietest mornings can be turned on their head by the unexpected. I had settled into the usual morning rhythm, grabbing a cup of coffee, slipping on my sneakers, and heading out with Max for a walk around the neighborhood. The air was cool, fresh with the promise of spring, and as we walked, I felt a faint sense of serenity. It was a rare moment when the world felt still, the city beyond the street seemingly locked in a suspended animation. As I walked, I found myself drifting in and out of thoughts, my mind wandering as it always did during these moments of solitude. Max trotted alongside me, his leash tugging slightly as he found something new to sniff another dog's scent, a passing car, or perhaps just the promise of adventure hidden in the morning air. For a brief moment, I considered how simple everything seemed, how perfectly ordinary. But that thought, that simple notion, would turn out to be the very thing I'd later regret thinking. Max's excited panting beside me was the only sound until a faint hum reached my ears, a car approaching from down the street. I glanced up, not really paying much attention at first. The car came closer, the sound of its engine growing louder, and I realized it was moving unusually fast for a quiet residential street. The vehicle zipped past us and turned down the road, but it was the way it turned, sharp and hurried, that caught my attention. It didn't belong in the pattern of morning traffic. It was out of place, unnerving in its abruptness. I stopped for a moment, watching it disappear around the corner, a sense of unease creeping up on me. But I quickly shook off the feeling. It was probably nothing, I told myself. The world was full of strange moments, and this was just another one. Max, however, seemed to notice something I didn't. He stopped in his tracks, his ears pricked up, eyes wide, as he stared intently at the house across the street. I followed his gaze, but there was nothing unusual about the house. Just a typical suburban home, its curtains drawn tight against the morning sun, the driveway empty save for a parked car. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, though I couldn't pinpoint what it was. We continued our walk, though the unease lingered in my chest like a distant rumble of thunder. But life had a way of dulling that sort of discomfort, and by the time we returned home, I had pushed the feeling into the back of my mind, convinced that there was no reason to worry. After all, the house was still empty. My parents hadn't returned yet, and the morning seemed to stretch out in front of me, peaceful, if only for a little while longer. I let Max inside and sat down at the kitchen table, checking the time. It was a few minutes past 10, plenty of time before I needed to start preparing for the day. My parents had gone out for their usual Saturday errands, which meant I was left with the house to myself. For a moment, the silence was almost too much to bear, and I wished I had something to occupy the space, a distraction from the stillness that had crept in like a fog. I considered going back to bed, but that would have felt wrong somehow. The house, too quiet and too empty, made me feel strangely vulnerable. That was when the first sound broke the silence. A car engine, the unmistakable hum of something powerful drawing closer. I looked up automatically, expecting to see a neighbor driving by or maybe a delivery van, but what I saw instead caught me off guard. It wasn't a neighbor's car. It was my parents' car. My heart skipped a beat. They were supposed to be out for hours. What were they doing back already? I jumped to my feet, a wave of panic flooding my chest. The house wasn't ready for their return. I hadn't done anything, I hadn't even cleaned up. The disarray of the morning lingered in every corner, from the pile of newspapers that had been left out to the half-drunk cup of coffee sitting on the counter. I could hear Max moving around in the living room, his excited little yelps echoing through the hall, but I didn't have time to think about him right then. The car was pulling into the driveway, its brakes squealing slightly as it came to a stop. I rushed toward the door, the sound of my footsteps too loud in the silence. I glanced at myself in the hallway mirror and immediately regretted that my hair was a mess, my clothes still wrinkled from a night of restless sleep. But there wasn't time to fix it. There was no time to do anything but stand there, frozen in the moment as my heart thudded in my chest. The front door opened with a soft creak, and my mom stepped inside, her eyes widening in surprise when she saw me standing there. "You're home already?" she asked, her voice tinged with confusion. I opened my mouth to speak, but before I could manage a response, my dad appeared behind her, his expression just as puzzled. "What are you doing here so early?" he asked, stepping into the house. I didn't expect you to be back yet," I stammered, trying to sound casual despite the adrenaline that was now pumping through my veins. "Well, we finished earlier than we thought." Had some time to spare, my mom smiled, but there was something in her gaze that shifted, something that felt like she was trying to piece together a puzzle. Her eyes flicked to the living room, where Max was now wagging his tail enthusiastically, as if nothing were wrong. Before I could say anything else, I heard the sound of something shifting in the kitchen. It was subtle at first, like a whisper, but it grew louder. My dad turned toward the sound, his face suddenly becoming serious. "What's that noise?" he asked, his voice low, his brow furrowing. His gaze darted around the room, as if searching for the source. Max, who had been calm just moments before, suddenly bolted toward the kitchen, barking excitedly. My heart sank. There was no reason for him to act like this unless something was wrong. I followed quickly, my feet heavy against the hardwood floor. The kitchen was empty, there was nothing there, but the sound continued. A faint clinking noise like metal tapping against something hard. My dad followed closely behind me, and we both paused at the entrance to the kitchen, our eyes scanning the space. And that's when I saw it. The fridge door was slightly ajar. A shadow flickered from inside, and the soft noise of shifting items came from within. My dad moved toward the fridge with cautious steps, his hand reaching for the handle. The seconds felt like hours. What was inside? What had caused the strange sound? As the door swung open, the truth hit me like a wave. It wasn't just the fridge making noise, it was something else entirely. Something I hadn't expected, something I couldn't have anticipated. Inside, nestled between the rows of leftovers and jars of pickles, was a small metal box. Its edges were rough, and its surface was coated with a layer of dust, as if it had been sitting there for a long time. But it wasn't just any box. It was a box I recognized. A box I had seen only once before, years ago in the attic, covered in a blanket of forgotten memories. The box my parents had always told me not to touch. My heart stopped. And then it started again, faster than ever, as everything that had been building the strange feeling from the morning, the unease, the weird little moments I had dismissed came crashing down in a single instant. I hadn't expected to find the box in the fridge. But now that I had, I knew nothing would ever be the same again. My dad stood in silence, his fingers still gripping the door handle. The box had not only been hidden, it had been moved. And that meant there was something I had missed, something important. The question was no longer about why the box was there, but what was inside it. But that was a question I would have to answer later, because before I could react, I heard Max bark again. This time his voice was different, urgent. And from the corner of the room, a shadow moved. That was when I knew the discovery had just begun, and nothing would ever be as simple as it once seemed. The days following the discovery of the box had been strange. At first, the house felt like it was holding its breath, as if the walls themselves were waiting for something. Every sound seemed louder, every glance sharper, and every conversation seemed to carry an undercurrent of unspoken questions. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, not just in the house, but in me. The discovery of the box, hidden away in the most mundane place, had revealed a side of our lives that we had all carefully forgotten. Now everything felt different. My dad had hardly said a word about the box since the moment we found it. His silence was oppressive, heavy, as if he were grappling with the very same questions I was too afraid to ask. But his eyes spoke volumes. They weren't just confused, they were afraid, a look I had never seen in him before. Max, on the other hand, had become a strange, almost uncanny presence in the house. Since the discovery, he seemed to sense something in the air that I couldn't quite place. He would sit quietly in corners, staring at nothing, his ears twitching at the slightest sound, as if listening for something far beyond my comprehension. There were moments when I caught him looking at me, his dark eyes as deep and knowing as a creature far older than the playful dog I had always known. It was as though he understood the weight of what had happened in a way I couldn't. I spent the next few days trying to return to my normal routine, but normalcy felt impossible. I would go through the motions, heading to work, meeting friends, doing laundry, but in the back of my mind, the image of that box, buried deep in the fridge, lingered like a stain that wouldn't wash away. It was a reminder that I was no longer in control of my own life. There was something hidden from me, something important, and it haunted me. One night, about a week after we had found the box, I came home late, tired and weary from the day's events. The house was quiet, and the faint hum of the refrigerator filled the silence, a sound I hadn't really noticed before. Max was curled up on the couch, his head resting on his paws, looking at me with that same knowing gaze. His eyes were soft, but there was something intense in them, a watchfulness, a patience. I dropped my keys on the kitchen counter and walked over to the couch, sitting down beside him. He nudged my hand with his nose, as if encouraging me to pet him. I absently scratched behind his ears, but the discomfort that had settled in my chest wouldn't leave. My thoughts kept returning to the box, to the strange and inexplicable events that had followed its discovery. Max tilted his head, watching me with quiet attention. It was as if he could sense my unease, his ears perked slightly, his body tense. I stopped petting him for a moment, lost in the depths of my thoughts, when something unexpected happened. Max let out a low, almost inaudible growl. It wasn't the playful growl he usually made when we were playing tug of war, or when a squirrel darted too close to the window. This was different. It was a warning. I froze. My heart thudded in my chest, and my mind immediately flashed back to that moment in the kitchen, the moment the box had been opened. A sudden, inexplicable thought struck me. What if the box wasn't just a box? What if it held something far more dangerous, far more powerful than I could possibly understand? Max's growl grew louder, more insistent, but there was something else in the air, something I hadn't noticed before. It was a faint, almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere, as if the very air itself had grown thicker, heavier. I stood up quickly, my senses on high alert, my heart pounding in my chest. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and for the first time in days I felt like I wasn't alone in the house. I moved cautiously toward the kitchen, my eyes darting from corner to corner. Max followed me, his tail low, his body tense with anticipation. He walked in front of me, his head raised, as if leading the way. We reached the kitchen, and for a moment, everything was still. The refrigerator hummed softly, and the familiar kitchen appliances sat undisturbed on the counter. But the box, no, the presence of the box was like a dark shadow that loomed over everything. Max stopped just in front of the fridge, his growl now a deep, low rumble vibrating in his chest. I took a step forward, my hands shaking, my breath shallow. I hadn't wanted to do this. I hadn't wanted to confront whatever was inside the box. But now, with Max acting as though something was terribly wrong, I felt I had no choice. I opened the refrigerator door slowly, dreading what I might find. The box was still there, exactly where we had left it. But something was different. The air around it was heavier, thicker, as if the box itself was pulling all the energy into it. I could almost feel it, an invisible force that emanated from the box, quiet yet undeniable. Max stood rigid at my side, his eyes never leaving the box. I reached for it, my hand trembling as I lifted the lid. As soon as my fingers brushed the metal, a strange, electric sensation coursed through my body. It wasn't painful, but it was unsettling, like an overwhelming awareness of something unknown. The box was empty. But inside, something had changed. The emptiness wasn't just a void, it was a presence, a hollow space that felt alive. I looked at Max, who was now panting softly, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and understanding. There was a moment of silence, a long stretch of time where everything in the room seemed suspended in the air, waiting for something to happen. And then, without warning, I heard a voice. Not from anywhere around me, but from within my own mind. It was faint, distant, but unmistakable. It was Max's voice. Not in the way I had heard him bark or whine, but a voice inside my thoughts. A voice full of urgency, full of something I couldn't quite comprehend. "You're not alone," it whispered. "You never were." I recoiled, my heart racing, my breath catching in my throat. I spun around, searching for the source of the voice. But there was nothing except the silence of the kitchen and Max, standing perfectly still, his gaze unwavering. "What is this?" I whispered aloud, my voice trembling. Max stepped closer, his head nudging against my leg, and I knelt down beside him, overwhelmed by a strange, inexplicable sense of connection. It was as if the boundaries between us had blurred, as if I could understand him in a way I never had before. The growl that had been in his throat earlier now seemed like a distant memory. The presence, the force, the energy that had been emanating from the box, it wasn't just an object. It was something that had affected us both. It was something that had connected us in a way that defied everything I had ever known. Max didn't just growl anymore. He was speaking to me, speaking in a way that was beyond language, beyond anything I could understand. But it was clear. There was a communication happening between us. Something primal, something ancient. He wasn't just my dog anymore. He was something else. The silence in the kitchen deepened. There was no sound of the refrigerator anymore, no ticking of the clock. Just the beating of my heart, the quiet shuffling of Max's paws, and the weight of what I had just discovered. I took a deep breath, slowly, as the realization began to settle in. Whatever this was, whatever had been awakened, I wasn't ready for it. But Max was. He knew what to do. And somehow I knew that, from this moment on, we were no longer just a human and a dog. We were partners in something far bigger. A connection had been made, and it was as though the veil between our worlds had been lifted, revealing something greater. Something that neither of us fully understood yet, but something that bound us together in ways that went beyond words. I stood up, looking at Max, who gazed back at me with those eyes that seemed to hold the secrets of the universe. A sense of understanding passed between us, and for the first time since the box had been discovered, I didn't feel so alone. We were in this together. And whatever came next, I knew one thing for sure: we would face it as a team. The morning after everything fell apart, I woke up to an oppressive silence. The house, once filled with the usual sounds of clinking dishes, my hurried footsteps and Max's soft growls, was unnervingly quiet. I could still hear the faint buzz of the refrigerator in the kitchen, but other than that, there was nothing, no hum of the washing machine, no rustling of papers. I turned over in bed, my muscles stiff, my mind heavy with the previous night's events. The things I had done, the things I had said. It was hard to even look at myself in the mirror. I could feel the weight of every moment that had led to this, each choice seeming like a step down a path I couldn't turn back from. Max, of course, wasn't there to greet me with his usual eager enthusiasm. His absence in many ways was the loudest presence in the room. After the discovery, after everything had come out into the open, there had been that moment where we both stood there, Max, standing silently beside the refrigerator, and I, staring at the empty box. There was no denying what had happened. I had crossed a line, and no matter how much I wanted to tell myself it was a misunderstanding, the truth was undeniable. What I had done to Max, the things I had asked of him, what kind of person had I become? I sat up in bed, my head still foggy with confusion. It wasn't as if I hadn't known that things were strained between Max and me over the last few weeks, but I had never realized the full extent of it until now. Max had always been there for me, loyal, patient, and endlessly forgiving, even when I failed him. But now, as I ran my hand through my hair, the guilt gnawed at me. What had I done to deserve such unwavering love from him when I had clearly betrayed his trust? I stood up slowly, the weight of my thoughts slowing me down. It was still early, and the house was dark with the soft light of dawn just beginning to spill through the windows. The stillness of the morning only made everything feel more real, the actions of the night before more final. I walked quietly into the kitchen, half expecting Max to be there, to greet me with his gentle bark, or even just to look at me with that knowing gaze. But there was nothing, no sound except the refrigerator. It felt like a void, the space where Max should have been. The box, still sitting in the fridge, was the first thing I saw when I opened the door. Its dull metallic surface seemed to mock me. I had thought, in a fleeting moment, that maybe if I had just left it there, things would have stayed normal. But how could anything stay the same after that? After the confrontation, after everything we had discovered about one another, how could I go back to what was before? I didn't know where Max was, but I had a sinking feeling that he wasn't going to be easy to find. The way he had reacted the night before, the way he had distanced himself, left me with a knot in my stomach. There was so much left unsaid between us, so much that needed to be resolved. I spent the morning searching the house for him. I called his name softly at first, my voice tentative, unsure of what to expect. It was as if the house had swallowed him up. The soft clinking of dishes as I moved about seemed to echo in my ears, reminding me of all the small, quiet moments we had shared. The sound of his paws tapping across the floor, the way he would nudge my hand when he wanted attention, his constant presence, everything felt so distant now. Finally, I found him curled up in the far corner of the living room, near the window. He wasn't asleep, but he wasn't looking at me either. His eyes, normally so full of life and mischief, were clouded, as if he were deep in thought. He barely acknowledged me when I approached, though I could see the slightest flicker of recognition in his gaze. He was there, but emotionally it felt as if he had pulled back. The bond we shared, that deep, unspoken connection, had been fractured, and I wasn't sure how to fix it. I crouched down, my knees creaking as I lowered myself to his level. For a moment I just sat there, watching him, letting the silence stretch out between us. There was so much I wanted to say, but no words felt right. The guilt still weighed heavily on me, and I could feel tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. I didn't want to cry. I didn't want to show weakness, not now. But it was impossible to hold it back. "Max," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything." He didn't move. He didn't bark or wag his tail. His ears flicked slightly at the sound of my voice, but that was all. I reached out hesitantly, extending my hand toward him. His fur was soft, still warm, but there was a coolness to the way he turned his head away from me. It stung. I had hurt him, and now it seemed like he was shutting me out. "I didn't mean to hurt you," I said, my voice shaking. "I was wrong. I shouldn't have. I shouldn't have put you in that position. You've always been there for me, and I." Max suddenly shifted, his head turning back toward me. There was a slight tilt to his head, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of recognition, a spark of the old Max, the one who had never turned away from me, no matter what. But it was fleeting. He stood up, stretched, and walked slowly past me, his tail low. I watched him, my heart sinking as he moved away, as if he needed space. I followed him at a distance, my steps slow and hesitant, not wanting to intrude. He made his way to the back door, his body tense. I stood there, unsure of what to do. Max had always been such a constant presence in my life, and now it felt like I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't quite understand. I opened the door for him without a word. He stepped outside, his eyes briefly meeting mine before he trotted off toward the yard. It wasn't the grand reconciliation I had hoped for, but it was something. It was a sign that he wasn't entirely lost to me, that there was still hope. The rest of the day passed slowly, and the emptiness of the house seemed to stretch on. Max remained outside for much of the day, and I didn't push him. I let him have his space, giving him the time he needed. As much as I wanted to rush in and make everything better, I knew that wasn't how it worked. I had hurt him, and I needed to show him that I was truly sorry, not just through words, but through my actions. That evening, as the sun began to set, Max came back inside. He wasn't the same as before, but there was a subtle shift. He moved with purpose, his tail wagging cautiously, as if unsure of how things had changed. He stopped just in front of me, his eyes meeting mine for the first time since the discovery of the box. I held out my hand slowly, waiting for him to make the next move. For a long moment he just stared at me, his expression unreadable. But then, something shifted. He sniffed my hand, his breath warm against my skin, and with a tentative motion he nudged his head into my palm. I exhaled slowly, the breath I had been holding for what felt like an eternity. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a step. It was a beginning. "I'm going to make this right," I whispered, looking down at him. "I promise." Max didn't bark or wag his tail in excitement, but there was a sense of understanding between us now. Maybe it wasn't all fixed in one moment. Maybe it wouldn't ever be the same. But we would work through it. We always did. And as I sat there, with Max leaning against my leg, I realized that making amends wasn't just about saying the right words. It was about showing up every day and proving through my actions that I was willing to be the person Max believed I could be. It was going to take time. But I was ready to try. Because that's what love is, isn't it? Trying, even when it feels like everything has gone wrong. Trying, even when you're not sure you can make it right. It's about showing up, even when the damage is deep, and giving everything you have to make it better. And for Max, I would do that.